The title of our program tonight draws from Dr. Rosen's remarkable book, The Wonder of Their Voices, the 1946 Interviews of David Boder. And we are honored to be in the presence of such a distinguished intellectual. So please join me in thanking Dr. Rosen and in welcoming him to Gainesville University of Florida. I want to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors and everyone who made this event possible, but I've learned by now, and this is something I learned from watching Sam Proctor from afar, if you start listing individuals or programs or centers, you will always get into trouble because you will always miss one, right? So I will encourage you to look at your print program. On the flip side, we have our co-sponsors listed. We can't do these programs without co-sponsors and without your support. And one of the reasons we want you to make sure and sign in tonight, our students and staff have sign-in sheets, is so we can add you to the Samuel Proctor Oral History program. We don't always ask for money, but we won't turn it down. But we really, seriously, our goal in oral history is to build community. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our volunteers, our very hardworking students and staff at the Proctor program. Their expertise, their dedication, the outreach has made this program this evening possible. So let's please take a moment to thank our co-sponsors and volunteers. Thank you. Dr. Rosen's presentation is an important event in the history of our university. His scholarly work has had a major impact on how we think about the Holocaust, how we think about oral history, and the study of memory. And at its foundation, I think it's fair to say that The Wonder of Their Voices is about the struggles of people from very different backgrounds and histories to connect with each other during times of trauma and dislocation. And if anything, the past century has been an epoch of trauma and dislocation on a global level. Therefore, the work of Alan Rosen imparts important lessons about the study of the human condition, past, present, and future. Before I formally introduce Dr. Rosen, I want to again direct your attention to our print program. Immediately following Dr. Rosen's presentation and the question and answer session right afterwards, we're going to adjourn upstairs to enjoy both kosher as well as non-kosher snacks and goodies. And Alan will also be signing copies of his book. The UF Bookstore was kind enough to join us this evening. That will be upstairs. We have an elevator right here, or you can take the stairs around the side, either side. We also have restrooms. If you need to take a break during the program, we just ask that you kind of go around the side there, and the restrooms are directly behind the backdrop here. You'll also notice in your program a short narrative by a talented young University of Florida student by the name of Scott Kraft. Scott Kraft is standing in the very back. He's wearing a tie, which is very unusual. It's as unusual as me wearing a tie, actually. Scott sat in on an oral history interview that was conducted by Ann Smith, who's sitting right here to my left. And if you look at your program, you'll see a picture of the gentleman that we were interviewing that particular day. And Scott has written a wonderful narrative about that interview experience with Mr. Frank Towers, a person who was part of a combat brigade who helped to liberate a train that was carrying nearly 2,500 young Jewish individuals to a concentration camp. And Frank Towers tells the story about how his unit was able to stop the train, and equally important, how he was able to reconnect many, many decades later with many of the young individuals who were actually on that train. And I point this out just to let you know, this is what we do in the oral history program. Our job is to put our students in contact with people who make history. We all have a story to tell. These are the types of stories that our staff and volunteers endeavor to share with students, scholars, and members of the general public using the most advanced digital technologies in the field of oral history. The founder of our program, who many of you here know, Samuel Proctor, was also a critical figure in the founding of Jewish studies at the University of Florida. The archives at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program contain nearly 200 oral history interviews with Jewish Americans. Our collections are also very strong in areas including Florida water and environment, African American experiences, Latino narratives, and immigration history. The event tonight is part of a larger public history program series that the Proctor program sponsors each year. And I invite you to join us over the next few weeks for some additional fun and educational programs. These include a lecture that's sponsored by the History Department by Dr. David W. Blight on the historical memory of emancipation. That will occur on the afternoon of February 22nd at the Smathers Library at 4 p.m. We're also co-sponsoring an event titled Recording a Revolution, Hip-Hop and Social Change in Africa, which will take place on Saturday, February 23rd at the Alachua County Library in downtown Gainesville. Finally, we hope you will join us next month, March 13th. We have some posters. Stephanie Kuntz, a very distinguished, internationally renowned expert on American feminism, and also my former undergraduate advisor, will be coming to the University of Florida to give a talk titled Mad Men, Working Girls, and Desperate Housewives, 50 Years of Feminism. And also, please again remember to fill out the sign-up sheets so that we can keep in contact with you about our upcoming events. And before I forget, the University of Florida is going to be offering first semester Yiddish next fall. Is that correct, Alice? And Alice, do you want to wave your hand? Or Professor Alice, if you want to talk about, learn more about that, that's a very important offering for this university. So I'm really glad to hear that we're offering first semester Yiddish. That's great, fabulous. So immediately following Dr. Rosen's talk, we will have the opportunity to ask him questions. If you would like to ask Dr. Rosen a question, please fill out the little question cards that you have in your programs, and we'll collect those about midway through his presentation, and then staff members will bring those to me. And we'll get to as many questions as we can. Probably, sometimes we don't get to all of them, but we'll continue to have an opportunity to dialogue with Dr. Rosen upstairs at the reception and the book signing. Now, I encourage you to read our formal description of Dr. Rosen on the print program. We have the academic credentials. We have many of the highlights of his career, though not nearly all of them. But rather than repeat that narrative by way of introduction, I'd like to share with you a brief story about Dr. Rosen and the impact he's already made on this community. This past Friday, Alan appeared on Hank Connor's weekly WUFT radio program, Connor Calling. Just out of curiosity, how many of us listen to Connor Calling? See, I told you, Dr. Rosen, it's a very popular program. In the studio with Hank Connor was College of Journalism Dean Emeritus Ralph Lowenstein, who's here this evening. The program in radio parlance was a big hit, and we received numerous enthusiastic calls, continue to receive them today. But one call in particular stands out. I wanted to use this gentleman's name, but he asked to remain anonymous. But he identified himself as a longtime member of Gainesville's Jewish community. He told me that your program, Dr. Rosen and Dr. Lowenstein, was the most educational and exciting radio program he had ever heard on WFT in 40 years. And he was especially excited about Alan's upcoming public appearance, saying, quote, and I don't want to mistake his words, I actually was transcribing, it's what we do in oral history, right? He said, quote, "We need more young men like Dr. Rosen. Very few people in our community listen to these stories anymore." He continued enthusiastically, he said, quote, "If you want my opinion, I think you should give that young man a job at the University of Florida. That's the best way President Machen will get the university into a top 10 ranking." So I replied, of course, that hiring Dr. Rosen is slightly above my pay grade in military parlance, but I will make sure to forward this gentleman's recommendation to Tigert Hall the next time I see Dr. Machen. But ladies and gentlemen and friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Rosen to the University of Florida.
On August 4th, 1946, in Paris, David Boder interviewed a young woman, Bella Zelik, 22 years old, from Poland, Jewish, from Sosland. That was the 20th interview that he had conducted. He conducted on that day, that August 4th, 5 interviews, and this one was the third of the 5 that he would do. He heard from Bella Zelik that she had lost a brother who was shot when the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, entered Sosland, and then went on to chronicle her fate during the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry that took place, sadly, from 1939 to 1945, and heard from her about her internment in the concentration camp at Auschwitz, Gross Rosen, and Gabelsdorf. At the end of the interview, David Boder says to her, "Thank you very much. Is there anything you want to tell your own people in America from you? The microphone is yours. What do you think we shall tell them about all these displaced people and deportees?" It must be noted that this interview was one of 6 that David Boder conducted that took place in English. Bella Zelik was very proud of her English, was fluent, and she then chronicled this fate in what was certainly not her first or even second or even third language, but English it was. So in response to David Boder's question, what do you think we shall tell them about all these displaced people and deportees? Bella Zelik said, "Well, I just send them regards, and I am happy that not everybody of the Jews went through such a hard time as we did." Again, it should be noted that when David Boder transcribed this interview some years later, he did not write "through such a hard time as we did," but he wrote "went through such a hell as we did." Hearing hard time as hell because he knew that's what she had gone through. So there's a pause. Bella Zelik then has, during this pause, turned to Boder and said, as Boder repeats, Bella wants to add a few remarks in Polish. Go ahead, Bella. Speaking in Polish, she says a very different message. "I would like to tell you, my friends, that all of us Jews ought to hate the Germans because of the wrongs which they did to us and our families, because they broke our hearts, broke our homes, and we ought never to forget that." End of the interview. So what we have is a bifurcated, split image of the implications of what happened during the war for this young Jew who on August 4th, 1946, is telling her story to a psychologist from the United States. And the two languages each have a story to tell, each have a message to share, and that becomes one of the extraordinary contributions that David Boder's 1946 Holocaust interviews bring. God willing, we'll return to perhaps try to parse a little bit more just the implications of that bifurcated message. But before then entering our short journey through the itinerary of David Boder's work, let me just first say a very heartfelt thank you to Professor Ortiz and the Proctor Center for all of their sensitivity toward my visit, to arrange a radio program that's listened to by millions of people, or maybe at least those in this room, there were some there, that it was really phenomenal. And I think that, first of all, I was very impressed with Hank Connor's sensitivity, truly. And the questions that he asked, the comments he made were so modestly and astutely inflected. And then we were privileged to have Dr. Lowenstein join us, which really added immeasurably to bring someone who was on the scene in the displaced persons camps. So it is a great privilege to be here. Thanks to all from the who have given their time to make this possible. The interviews with Holocaust survivors that we usually know about are those that took place gladly at the under the auspices of the Shoah Foundation that came by way of Steven Spielberg's generosity, where from early 1990s into the early 2000s, some 50,000 people, survivors worldwide, were interviewed to chronicle their stories, what had happened, what they went through, where they came from, what had taken place after the war. And those gladly are available at different repositories throughout the world that we can benefit from. The Fortunoff interviews from Yale University, begun in 1979 by my colleagues Dory Laub and Jeffrey Hartman, have been very influential in being able to alert the communities to the power of oral memoir, in Jeffrey Hartman's term, that are told about these events. Both of these use the media of video, and in fact seized on that media in order to try to convey the body language, the gesture, the wink of the survivors as they told their story. And those stories were felt to be so urgent in our recent times because survivors are, as the way of all mortals, aging. The denialists of the Holocaust have become more vociferous. There's become a change, it's argued, in the sensibility of the community at large in hearing about these stories. And there's been generally more of an impetus to move from private memories to public memory, to feel that this is the time that survivors, after so many years, could share their stories, could share their testimony, could give a deposition. And that's all well and good. but we're often left with a sense that there was no testimony before this. That for various reasons, this is something that's only on the scene recently. But it's not the case. Because from 1944 to 1949, meaning while the war was still taking place, to some 4 years after it unfolded, there was survivor testimony gathered in Europe in the thousands. Some 7,000 interviews in Poland, 2,500 in Germany, 3,500 in Hungary, interviews in Czechoslovakia, in Austria, in Italy, all undertaken by survivor commissions that felt it was urgent to get the record of what had taken place. Otherwise, the story would become obscured or, worse, perverted. These historical commissions would write up what they heard. Sometimes they interviewed in groups, multiple survivors, 2, 3, 10, 20, and they were bent in a dedicated way on naming names. Who did what to whom? Who should be found to make them account for their crimes? And these historical commissions, with the interviews in the thousands, roughly 12 to 15,000 interviews in the first 5 years after the war, really began the effort to chronicle what was happening that began in the ghettos. There were also individuals who sought to seek these depositions. Leib Chaniakovsky in Lithuania went from survivor to survivor, some 150, and he then wrote up what they had said in almost novelistic form. And then he, when going to the displaced persons camps, would interview in groups and take them, show them what he had written up, receive their signatures that it was authentic, and receive a stamp from the leader of the Jewish community in the displaced persons camp that this was authentic testimony. This is the community that David Boder should be seen among. Meaning, his efforts were quite modest in relation to the larger whole. He interviewed 130. But what he did that no one else thought of doing was to bring with him a wire recorder, an early version of magnetic recording that was state-of-the-art in America at that time, 1946, and he recorded all the interviews, as far as we know, that he endeavored to undertake. They are, as far as we know, the earliest interviews that we have of survivor testimony, and they are still with us. And we can reach behind the arc of these recent Shoah Foundation, Fortunoff Foundation interviews to those that came just about a year after the war ended, from survivors ranging in age from 10, 12 years old to 75. In order to have an appreciation for Boder's efforts, we need briefly to have a sense of who he was and what brought him to undertake this interview mission in summer of 1946. David Boder was born in 1886 in Libau, Latvia, which had a sizable Jewish community. His name at birth was not David Boder, but rather Aron Mendel Mikkelsen. The David Boder came later. He grew up traditional education, went to a higher Jewish education in Vilna, and then went for a summer in 1906 to study with Wilhelm Wundt, one of the great masters of psychology in the early 20th century in Leipzig. He then went back to St. Petersburg and studied with Vladimir Bekhterev and became a psychologist. During the First World War, having married and had a child and undergone a divorce during that time, he and his child fled the tumult of the First World War, eventually going to Siberia, then to Japan, immigrating from Russia in 1919, going to the New World, to Mexico, where he was from 1919 to 1926, with various important positions and contributions in Mexican psychology of this time. In 1926, he immigrated to the United States, based in Chicago, was on the faculty and eventually became chair of the psychology department at Illinois Institute of Technology. And it was there at that time that he came to the idea that what should be done at the end of World War II was go and interview the displaced persons. Strikingly, it's really an amazing insight that pushed him to this, because his knowledge, his own knowledge of the Holocaust, as we now call it, was informed by the motion picture newsreels. Some here, Professor Hansen, Dr. Lowenstein, others may remember from those days at the end of the war, newsreels that circulated in the theaters of silent footage of the liberation of concentration camps. That footage is available now if one has the fortitude to see it. And Boder, while certainly appreciative of what was brought through there, he understood, however, that there was no story, that the survivors did not speak. And what he wanted to do was to elicit, as a psychologist, the story that lay beneath those images. So he went in summer of 1946, after lobbying for clearance to post-war Europe for about a year. He went in summer, arrived July 29th of 1946, which in the Jewish calendar, appropriate enough, was Rosh Chodesh Av, the day that begins the month of mourning. And he was there until October 4th, 1946, when he, which can be appreciated by faculty at this university, had to return to teach the fall semester. So if you're on the books there, you can't say, well, I'm sorry, things are going so well, I'll come back in another week. But no, he was very responsive. During those 10 weeks or so that he was in Europe, he conducted 130 interviews, as I mentioned, with young and old, women and men, Western and Eastern European, religious and non-religious, and again, singularly, as far as I know, among all these other very important oral history projects going on during this time. Contemporary to his was the only one to interview Jews and also Christians. Most of the interviewees were Eastern European Jews, and of those, most were Polish. Of the Western European Jews, they're included, they're not really Western European, but important to mention, 7 Greek Jews, number of whom spoke to David Boder in Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, and he, having gone to Mexico, had Spanish to add to his multitude of languages that he spoke. He ended up interviewing in 9 languages. In the Jewish world, there were the extremes of passionately Torah-observant Jews from Lithuania and Eastern Europe to very assimilated Jews of Czechoslovakia and Germany. Most of those he interviewed went through labor and or concentration camps. And Boder began every interview with the invitation, we can say, to the interviewee, saying, we know very little in America of the things that happened to you people who were in the concentration camps. Please tell us what happened to you with the start of the war. Strikingly, you can go today to see all of the transcripts of the interviews. Going to the website that we're going to, God willing, see in just a minute, called Voices of the Holocaust. But you won't see that phrase at the head of any of them, because Boder felt that that phrase was for the interviewees and between him and them, not for the audience that would come later. There were also over 20 Jews who had not been in concentration camps, but rather in ghettos, hiding, fleeing to or fighting for Russia. 21 of the Jews, 21 non-Jews were interviewed, and he emphasized children and youth. In addition to the interviews themselves, he also collected songs, and we're indebted to David Boder for songs that come from the time of the Holocaust that are found nowhere else. And eventually, he modulated in the interviews to conducting song sessions on their own, because like those interested in collecting folklore, in getting to the culture that drove the people to whom they were and where they were, that's what he felt was crucial. He also wanted to educate America. So as I mentioned, any chance he would have of interviewing in English, he would seize the opportunity, because he knew that in America, here, as we in America undergo the tumult of immigration policies now, remember that in the wartime and post-war, immigration policies were rigid. And he wanted to use the interviews to advocate that these people deserved entry to America, would make fine citizens, would not be a burden on the country. Quite the contrary. So our time is short, and we want to have lots of time for questions. And I'll say the acoustics with the playing the interviews are not stellar. So maybe what I'll do is save that for you to listen yourself at the Voices of the Holocaust website. You can find language, you can find setting, you can find nationality. And through that, we'll continue. And maybe I can just then conclude this portion before our questions, and I'd want to end with a story to say what the sum of contributions of Boder's work is. First, the early interviewing itself. We hear that there were many others, but Boder, being a psychologist, interviewed in a different way that he did not call oral history, but rather a kind of psychological interviewing that wanted, he said, to get at the impact of catastrophe on personality. We have no other like it. Second, he used audio. And though we're obsessed with the image that can come to us in video, film, and otherwise, to hear these voices is itself an education in the tone of responding to catastrophe. Third, the interviews in 9 languages is unparalleled. And every language, as we heard from Bella Zelik, tells the story of what happened in a different way. Fourth, this education for America at this time undermines the presumption that America didn't care, was indifferent. It funded Boder. It sent Boder. It received Boder from some of the finest institutions in the country. And lastly, if one moves chronologically, which I felt as a kind of budding oral historian felt that I needed to do, if you move chronologically through the interviews, you find that Boder underwent an evolution of knowledge. When he first heard of Auschwitz, he was simply perplexed at what he was told about burning bodies alive. Terrible, terrible knowledge. And then he became educated, and the world that he heard in September and October was not the world that he heard in July. And we can replicate that same movement. And back to conclude with Bella Zelik and her different message. One that of gratitude that the Jews all didn't need to go through this. And she's talking about the Jews of America especially. And then also the message of memory. We ought to hate for breaking our hearts and breaking our homes. And both messages, I think, are bracing ones that we need to take stock of, fuse together, and be able to hold in our broken hearts today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosen. I have some questions. Would you like me to read them?
However you'd like to.
I'll read the questions.
Okay.
And these are questions from our audience. The first question is, have you done any work yourself on interviewing Holocaust victims? If so, how has your experience been different from Boder's, and how has his techniques influenced your approach?
Ooh, what a wonderful question. Everyone heard the question? Can I ask who asked that question? Or are they supposed to remain anonymous? Is that, I don't know the rules.
It's their choice.
Uh-huh. Pardon? That's terrific. Thanks. So I haven't, I have done a little interviewing of Holocaust survivors, not much formally, but I've done a great deal, personally it feels like a great deal of speaking to Holocaust survivors who are either teachers or friends of mine. I had the great privilege of having Elie Wiesel as my dissertation advisor, and it's my teacher and now my colleague and friend, and there are numbers of others. And I also, for a number of years, helped to organize a survivor group in Boston, Massachusetts, at a regular basis. So I have some. So that was largely before I became familiar and immersed in the Boder interviews. But I think then it's a wonderful question to ask. I think I have been influenced because I think that there is I come away from the Boder interviews with a deeper appreciation for the sense of the way that such interviews can educate from the ground up. Let me say that way.
And Dr. Rosen, what is the impetus or the source of inspiration that drives you to spend your career discussing and sharing what you know about the Holocaust? And secondly, what do you hope comes of your efforts?
Another great question. What is the source and inspiration? Okay. Let me answer that a little bit sideways to even intensify the question. We speak in the Jewish calendar, it is the second or really the third day of the month of Adar. This is the month in which the holiday of Purim falls, which is a celebration of the Jews escaping from a genocidal endeavor in Persia several thousand years ago. We're told with this month that Misha Niknas Adar Marbim V'Simcha, that we have to increase our joy, because the joy at being able to escape such an event is the greatest joy in the world. So the question I come back to is intensified right now about the Holocaust and what drives me and the source of inspiration, because if this time is given to joy, and let me extend that to say, with the permission of my colleagues, that as teachers, our goal in teaching our students and studying with our students is really joy. It's really to deepen the awareness of the greatness of life, of the hope that life has. And the Holocaust takes one to the other side. Sadness, broken hearts, broken homes, in the most comprehensive and evil way. So what drives me and is the responsibility to not have these stories be eradicated. I think that's fair to say, that the people were largely, unfortunately, tragically eradicated, murdered. So the stories that their survivors and the victims during the war tell are crucial to have, because, as we know, every story is populated by the majority of those that didn't survive. Every survivor story. So then back to the beginning, then my struggle, which is really the challenge that I face, that is a student of Elie Wiesel and other great masters teaching and responding to the subject, is how do we communicate this sense of preserving the stories of those whose names and fates deserve at least as much, while at the same time not leaving our students drained of joy. And that's really my inspiration, is one of the survivors who somehow still, with those two messages of Bella Zelik in their hearts, have rebuilt lives, and even more than that, somehow communicated joy to their children and their spouses and their communities, even with hazarding the risk of testifying about these events. So they are my source and inspiration, I think it's fair to say.
Dr. Rosen, was any aspect of Boder's research or work considered controversial? This must be a history major.
Is Sarah?
Sarah.
Yes. She even wrote her name there. That's brave and very nice. Yes. The question was, what aspects of David Boder's work were, and in a certain way remain, because it's really in the present. I mean, we listen to these, and as I hope to bring forth in the coda, that they have to speak to us today. So the controversy, for example, is that Boder, when he transcribed these interviews, first of all, the interviews were done in 9 different languages, only 6 in English. Those that he himself transcribed with the help of a survivor student named Bear Wolf, they're all transcribed in English, meaning he translated them, 70 of them, into English and transcribed them in English. So first of all, it was controversial because we didn't have the original language that was there. And if language was so important, which he himself definitely felt, then how could we suffice with a translation? On top of that, and very interesting, and I admire him so much for this, but it's controversial nonetheless, is that when he transcribed these in English, he attempted to try to preserve the brokenness of the language of those who had gone through concentration camps or who had been in hiding and whose language became defective, I think it's fair to say, or marred or scarred through those experiences. And he, even while having the chutzpah, the bravado to do to translate these, he tried to maintain the sense of how those languages themselves were traces of the traumatic experiences, as he saw it, that the interviewees had gone through. So that was very controversial. One of my predecessors in working on the David Boder interviews is a historian that some of it in this room will know, Professor Giles, Professor Freifeld, that Donald Niewyk at Southern Methodist University in Texas brought out a book called Fresh Wounds in 1998, where he took 36 of the Boder interviews and edited them. And the editing includes correcting the English so that one reads it in a smooth way, meaning he wasn't very polemical about it, but a polemic was certainly there, meaning to say that we can get the same and we can relate to these interviews better if we read them in what is smooth. While Boder, to my mind, bless his heart, felt the opposite. We can really try to enter the milieu of these interviews through the staccato rhythm of what he created with the language that attempts to simulate what was being spoken to him. So that's a patch or a piece of what was controversial in Boder's work and remains so to this day.
Time for one more question, and we'll adjourn for the reception of the book signing.
First, the coda.
Oh, we'll do the coda first, and then the book signing.
Good.
We've rehearsed this in advance.
Yes, several times, for weeks on end, really. Right. I was really here for several weeks, stood right here, and we did this, you know.
Almost like the Grammys, right?
I guess so.
Dr. Rosen.
You're going to sing?
No, and I'm not going to rap either. Dr. Rosen, do you believe that video interviews have more power than audio interviews? And then the last question, why do you think Boder emphasized the interviews he collected as a source of literature?
Okay, there's really two parts.
There's two parts.
One, do I believe that video has more power than audio, and why did he emphasize literature? These are such wonderful questions because they really allow for opening up the breath. No, I don't believe that video is stronger than audio. I believe that audio can, I hope Hank Connor would agree, that audio can address us in ways that we're distracted by video. Not always, and the collision between the two I don't want to emphasize, but I believe audio can bring us things generally that are specific to its media in our attentiveness that we give to the words. Second, particularly with Boder, Boder is the only one, as far as I know, of all the interviews during this time and all the transcriptions that were done that recorded his questions. And to see the kind of questions he asked is an education in itself. And how does that relate back to audio? Because for those who have some experience watching either the Shoah Foundation or Fortunoff Foundation, or I assume other video oral history interviews generally, if not always, they focus almost exclusively on the interviewee. That's who's there on the camera. That's who seemed to have prime importance. When we hear the Boder interviews, it's a constant dialogue. It's a constant movement back and forth from the questioner to the question. And at times, in the best of circumstances, for example, in what I believe is the key interview that Boder gave or undertook with a young man, 20-year-old man named Avram Kimmelman, 20 years old, lasted 4 hours, twice as long as any other interview, 8 times as long as most. At that point, Kimmelman turns questioner on Boder. And it's being able to see the migration of the movement of those questions, which are there in the transcript. We are educated by the record, the deposition of Boder's questions. So I think that's crucial. And the second part of the question had to do why Boder saw these under the rubric of literature. Now, all of my dirty laundry comes out. I'm really, by training, a literary critic, not a historian. So my attraction, in fact, to the Boder interviews was first through the prism of literature. And that's because David Boder and I shared a sense that the rubric, the framework of literature, could come to interviews that were fraught with historical significance and information. And yet the literary perspective makes us attuned not only to what the interview is talking about, but how it talks about it. The narrative movement, the narrative flow, the narrative interruption. Boder, in a very revealing comment, says that every time I asked a question, it would divert the interviewee from a thought that they likely were going to share. So one needs to, as it were, be an archaeologist and dig up that thought that lays embedded there behind. So that's one of the aspects that I think allows that Boder saw to be pregnant in the interviews that literature could then birth. Good. So these were wonderful questions, and I want to end with then a coda, which is a story that I tell frequently, but not always, when speaking about the Boder interviews because, as I said, it's not just in the past but in the present. But the story has roots in a very different era and climate. In the late 18th century, there was a very distinguished rabbi, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was accused in Russia of committing the capital crime of treason because he was collecting money on behalf of Israel, and Israel, being under the Ottoman Empire during that time, was an enemy with Russia, and so he was seen to be working for them. He was imprisoned in a not a very kind prison in St. Petersburg. And while he was there, the prison warden, who was a devout Christian, heard about this holy rabbi who was in the prison. So he asked, sent a messenger, could I meet with the rabbi? And Rabbi Shneur Zalman gave his permission, and the warden came. And he was struck, first of all, by the appearance of the rabbi that radiated immense light. And then he said, with the rabbi's permission, I'd like to ask a question about the Bible. And the rabbi said, fine. And he said, well, in the early narrative of the Bible, we hear that Adam and Eve commit the sin of eating from the forbidden fruit. The rabbi says, yes. And then he says, and then they after they realize that they have committed a sin, they go and hide. And the rabbi says, yes. And he says, and then God calls out, Ayeka, where are you? So the warden says to the rabbi, what kind of a question is this? God, who knows everything in the universe, everything that always is and was, says, how could he ask Adam and Eve, where are you? There's a few bushes that are covering them, and he wants to know, where are you hiding? Is this a game of hide and seek? And so Rabbi Shneur Zalman looks at him, and he says, do you believe that the Bible is eternal? He says, yes, I do. He says, do you believe it speaks to every generation where they are at that point in time, that one is earlier, later, whenever? He says, yes, I do. He says, then I want to say to you that the question that God is asking Adam and Eve is not the literal, where are you, in terms of being hidden by the bushes. But he was asking, where are you in your life? Where are you now that you've committed this sin? Where are you in terms of your future, in what you're doing, in making a contribution to the life that is there for yours to have and hold till your days come to an end? That's what he was asking. And he looks at the warden and he says, you who are today 47 years old, and the rabbi did not know this by any kind of natural means. It says, you who are 47 years old, where are you, the Bible is asking. Where are you in terms of what you've done with your days and what you will do with your days? So my contention is that the Boder interviews, Bella Zelik, Avraham Kimmelman, and others, the 128 others, and David Boder himself, are ways for us to feel addressed by the question, where are you? These interviewees, part of an immense number of displaced persons after the war, gave anywhere from a half hour to 4 hours of their time to tell a story that was heartbreaking. And we can treat it, and we should treat it, like history and like literature and like psychology. But I think to really savor what the significant is, we have to let the interviews say to us, where are you? Thank you very much.